Thanks a lot for the introduction. Uh, Everyone can hear me? I'll take that as a yes.
Yes.
Yes, good
Yes.
sound.
So here, we're looking at just one aspect of what Attila Baran was just talking about. So he mentioned that you have to be careful with the sources, uh, and indeed, and many historians have noticed that there's these lurid and exaggerated accounts that are kind of normal, especially with these European sources regarding the Mongols. Here's a picture from Matthew Paris's Chronica Maiora. Very famous image. It's actually depicting the Tatars, as they were known, in action, cannibalizing, slaughtering. They've got a virgin on the right tied up to a tree, and this is related to a lot of these accounts of them as from the very first mentions of Matthew Paris. His very earliest mentions of Tatars, we see a monstrous inhuman race of men burst from the northern mountains. It really sounds like J.R.R. Tolkien sort of inspiration. They feed on raw flesh and human beings. They're sent as a plague on mankind. These are quotations from Matthew Paris. And this stuff appears around the year 1238, just as this Batu's campaign has been only going for really 2 years or less at that point. But it's starting to overrun the distant frontiers of Europe, the Volga River region, and then Rus and the Kipchaks. So you can see this information starting to pour in to Europe. We even read that the Mongols are become known as the detestable race of Satan as they advance a little further. So it's a pretty strong statement. And perhaps the most shocking of all the material of Matthew Paris is a shocking letter about the cruelty of the Tatars, written by one Ivo of Narbonne. And he was writing to Gerald, the Archbishop of Bordeaux. He witnessed a Mongol attack. How do I get rid of this chat thing? Okay, there. Okay. On Neustadt. And Ivo indeed explains it means new city, which wouldn't surprise anyone because it sounds like modern German, Neustadt. Nova Civitas. And this was in Austria, where he was staying with the Bagwines at one point, or Bagwins, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. The besieged town was allegedly, according to Ivo's letter, relieved by the Duke of Austria, King of Bohemia, Patriarch of Aquila, Duke of Carinthia, and a few others. You saw it in the last presentation. And the Mongols were put to flight. Ivo calls the Mongols Tatari, in this letter that seems to be verbatim, which rather than Tartar, which is normally appearing in Matthew Paris's chronicle, and Johannes Giesauf suggested this might be an argument for its authenticity. It has this more Asiatic pronunciation of the name of the Tartars, the Mongols. On the other hand, it has by far the most colorful descriptions of Mongol cruelty. The prisoners being fed to literally dog-headed cannibals. The breasts of virgins were cut off and given to the chiefs as delicacies, according to this eyewitness source. And also, another problem, there's no other source documenting an attack on Wiener Neustadt. And we don't even know when this very summer is, though presumably it's the summer of 1241 when the Mongols were in Poland and Hungary. And there's also a famous English prisoner, and he comes with a full backstory included. He's the Khan's Englishman, according to a very famous book, kind of a semi-fiction, but based on this evidently true story. It was a criminal drifter who got employed because of his language knowledge in the Mongol Empire as an interpreter. The Prince of Dalmatia took him prisoner in Austria, and he was recognized by the Duke of Austria, who had been in Hungary and had seen this guy twice as an envoy of the Mongols to the Hungarian court. The problem with dismissing this story, even though it does read like fiction, hence a writer picked it up and ran with it and wrote a well-known book, is that some of the details match with things we know about Mongols. Like they would recruit a polyglot as an interpreter. They would use people like this, talented people. Also, it's just plain weird to make this story up. Why is a Ivo of Narbonne? Why would anyone make this story up? Oh, there's an Englishman, and they invent a whole story about him. I don't know. You could say they don't like the English or something. Let's look at another Austria-related case, though, that's semi-fiction, and this will hopefully highlight a problem with just dismissing things like Ivo of Narbonne's letters utterly. When you see something that's strange and you just say, it has some parts of it that don't sound right. The atrocities of the Mongols seem exaggerated, and then if you dismiss it, you might miss something. So we're going to look at this case of Hayton's account of the drowning of Batu really quickly. This image is often depicted as the Battle of Muhi, but it comes from a manuscript in the Austrian National Library. So many of you can probably go look at this if you want. And here's the full page. And it's actually from Hayton's The Flower of the Histories of the Orient. He's an Armenian who dictated this book in French. And basically the story isn't about the Battle of Muhi. This image isn't really the Battle of Muhi. It's about the story Hayton or Hetum tells is that the Tatars headed towards the Kingdom of Germany until they reached a river that flows through the Duchy of Austria. The Duke of Austria was blocking the bridge. Batu tried to lead a crossing, and he drowned with a huge multitude of his followers. And the Mongols were struck with dread and shame and returned to Russia and Comania. And thereafter, they didn't go to the country of Germany. So it kind of relates to this stuff that Ivo of Narbonne is describing. Possibly there's Germany in here, there's Austria, but it's obviously not true. Batu didn't drown. However, a story like this doesn't develop from nothing at all. Hayton, he wrote a book that's full of errors, but parts of that story definitely resemble aspects of widespread accounts of the Battle of Muhi in Hungary, for instance. We can skip that. Because the Battle of Muhi, according to Chinese Mongolian sources, this battle fought in Hungary between Bela IV's forces and Subutai and Batu, has a botched river crossing, but it was, of course, not a Mongol defeat. However, several Western authors mention that though Muhi was a catastrophe for the Hungarians trying to defend their country from the invaders, there was a point where the crossing of the river was botched. And we read, for instance, that a great number of the Mongols were killed, according to Thomas of Split. They were sort of ambushed in mid-crossing, and they were forced off the bridge and drowned in the river, literally. It sounds a bit like what Hetum was saying about this Austria thing. C. de Bridia, a Franciscan, notes that the commanding Mongol general at the bridge was thrown into the river and drowned by the brother of Bela IV. In the Yuanshi, you have this negative memory again of Muhi. The troops of Batu fought for the bridge over this Shayo River. The enemy was winning, and Batu's subordinate general Batur dies. And then after managing to cross the river, the Mongol princes were discouraged by the numbers of the enemy and said to their kind of senior advisor, Subete, that they want to withdraw. And there was an argument about withdrawing and staying, with Subete vehemently wanting to stay, saying if you retreat by yourself. And so arguments about this disaster went on for a while, and the death of this general, Batur, which bears a resemblance to Batu, but it means something like, it's an epithet meaning a hero, great leader. And anyway, Bar Hebraeus, Syriac writer, likely mentions regret amongst the Mongols when they invaded Europe. So there's something floating around. But here's another one you might not know. The History of the Patriarchs of Alexandria, a Coptic source, kind of touches on some of these talking points, these key points of this unhappy event that happened in Europe. So a detachment of the Tatars turned towards the land of the Germans and the Swabians, apparently, and they didn't gain anything, and there were killed of the Tatars and the Franks a great number of people, and the defeat was for the Tartars. And the ones who escaped, except a small part because they had crossed over the river. So again, we got the river coming up, the setback, there's Germans involved. So I wonder, like, is Ivo of Narbonne's Neustadt event part of this overarching picture. And the one thing we have to ask is we got to revisit this scholarly assumption. It's a logical assumption that Neustadt is Wiener Neustadt. But that's the south of Vienna, approximately 71 kilometers. And it's south of the Danube River, which importantly wasn't crossed, apparently. Bela IV noted he held the Mongols back for 10 months. So it wasn't allegedly crossed in the summer of 1241, which is when we should assume this is happening. So therefore, the Mongols couldn't have reached Wiener Neustadt. And Ivo mentioned Neustadt neighboring the city of Vienna, which doesn't sound like 61 kilometers to me in the Middle Ages. Could be, but it doesn't seem like it. Doesn't seem intuitive. And that, Ivo mentioned he'd lived in Vienna and the surrounding area, and then he was in the aforementioned town, Neustadt, when the Mongols arrived, and he could hear locals outside the walls being killed. And I put it to you, couldn't it be that Neustadt was actually Korneuburg, which is only 12 kilometers north of Vienna? So he was in the suburbs, kind of. It's Proxima, it's close, which is documented to have been attacked and which is just north of the Danube River. So if Orda and Baidar's forces had won the battle at Liegnitz against the Silesians and some other Polish forces, and then they were pulling south down the trail of the Danube to Hungary, which is documented in the sources, Korneuburg, sitting north of the Danube, would be vulnerable to attack. And the annals of Klosterneuburg, conveniently south of the protective Danube River, documents this attack and the killing of people, great destruction at Neuburg, which would be Korneuburg. Another thing is that Civitas can mean just a walled settlement in medieval Latin. We don't have to take it as a metropolis or something. And think about Ivo of Narbonne's description of the number of defenders being really small. Well, that would make sense if it was a tiny town. He says, there were no soldiers on our side in the town. He doesn't mean on our team. He means on our side. Now, what does he mean by that? Perhaps he's talking about Korneuburg and Klosterneuburg on the two sides of the river, and he's on the unlucky side in the town of Korneuburg. So there's only 50 knights and 20 crossbowmen there, whom the Duke had left as a garrison. This seems like it's a small place. Anyway, so here's a map, and there's Vienna to Korneuburg. It's just 12 kilometers. It's the vicinity. It's the neighborhood where he was kind of lingering. Another thing you might think about is he mentions Beguine communities or Beguine. I didn't look into them. This would be better if you ask someone who's an ecclesiastical historian or a church historian. But you could narrow in on this by finding out where there were Beguines. I know there were some in Vienna. The question is, were there some at Klosterneuburg or Korneuburg, for instance? Might be traceable. There is a lot of data. And then you look on this map, and you see way down there, there's Wiener Neustadt. So imagine that the Mongols did attack Wiener Neustadt. They would have actually perhaps entered and passed by Vienna, the capital of Austria. Oh, by the way, Ivo of Narbonne mentions some heights around the town where they looked at the Mongols and saw their armies all spread out fearfully. I imagine this was before their arrival. And there are big hills like this, even north of the Danube. So it is possible. It can work. So I propose the solution that what Ivo of Narbonne is describing, in fact, largely happened. The basic story happened, and it's this documented attack on the border of Austria in the summer of 1241. Duke Friedrich of Austria, we have two letters where he's twice reporting a small victory on his borders as the Mongols were making their way between Bohemia and Hungary. In the first he records 300 dead enemies, and then in July, and then 2 weeks later, another report, he says 700 had been slain. Another point to keep in mind that the Nibelungenlied, written around 1200 by an Austrian author, uses the term Burg and Stadt interchangeably to refer to Attila's capital. For instance, Etzelberg, it appears as Etzelstadt at one point. And likewise, the deeds of the Hungarians, written around the same time, but in Latin, by a Hungarian author, employed the German term Burg to refer to a large town, namely Attila's capital. So these terms can perhaps they're not as watertight in their definition. I'm saying it's feasible that Ivo could have called it Neustadt when it became the core Neuburg we know today, Neuburg. If the Mongols reached Wiener Neustadt, that would not be described by Duke Friedrich as his borders. He never says the Mongols have penetrated Austria, none of his surviving writings, but he does refer to their doing damage on his borders. And lastly, this letter from a Templar, Ponce de Bon, mentioned in the last presentation, he notes that the Patriarch of Aquila and the King of Bohemia have made a coordinated army and that the Mongols don't dare to confront it. I do think that this does resemble a bit what Ivo said. So I'm just saying, perhaps we should not be so quick to dismiss this source. Thanks.